Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. EU leaders strike a €90 billion deal to bankroll Ukraine's war effort, but frozen Russian assets remain off the table. Newly released photos from Jeffrey Epstein's estate raise fresh questions about his network and what the DOJ may be holding. And protests erupt across Bangladesh after the death of the student leader who overthrew Sheikh Hasina's government. Now, Vladimir Putin has compared EU leaders to burglars for trying to use Russian frozen assets to help Ukraine. The Russian president also dismissed fears that his country would attack Europe as nonsense. This comes after the bloc agreed a €90 billion loan to fund Ukraine's war effort for another 2 years. Take a listen to what Vladimir Putin had to say.
It is entirely incorrect and unfounded to claim that we reject anything. The ball is entirely in the court of our Western opponents, primarily the leaders of the Kyiv regime, and in this case, first and foremost, the European sponsors. We are ready for both negotiations and a peaceful resolution to the conflict.
For more on this, I'm joined by Michael Bociurkiw, Global Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Michael, it's great to have you back on the show with me. Thank you for joining me. First of all, what do you make of this? Ukraine appears to be relieved to have the money, but it's a very different signal being sent to Russia, isn't it?
Yes, good to be with you again, Leigh-Ann. Yeah, absolutely. And that was a very boisterous, confident Vladimir Putin, wasn't it, at this almost 5-hour marathon press conference where he reiterated a whole litany of accusations, of course, without evidence, but also issued the same Maximus demands for Ukraine, not joining NATO, pulling back its armed forces, so on and so forth. But, you know, for Ukraine, they described the issuing of this so-called loan as, quote unquote, a workable result. But look, at the end of the day, this is European taxpayers' money being used to back a loan to Ukraine, which probably won't be repaid. And at the end of the day, the EU caved. And I think part of that was due to, sad to say, very effective Russian intimidation and bullying, especially the Belgians. And, you know, I think the Belgians have to take some responsibility for what happened. Their leader melted like a piece of Belgian chocolate in a microwave oven at the end of the day. But what they need to understand, Leigh-Ann, is that the cost of inaction is going to be a lot costlier than doing something. War is always more expensive than peace. And if they don't all get on board to defend Ukraine, to push Mr. Putin back, he will be on their doorstep sooner than we know it.
And it's really interesting because that 5-hour conference that Vladimir Putin was giving, as you said, he actually looked quite sprightly. I couldn't believe he went on for 5 hours. Pretty impressive coming from him today. But I just want to press you on one more thing. So European leaders clearly failed to disagree on using Russia's frozen assets. Like you said to me, Belgium almost melted like a chocolate. How is Europe looking now? They look so divided because we've heard Donald Trump criticizing the European Union. And now I wonder what Vladimir Putin must be thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Europe looks very divided, and this is something he would look on to with glee. And, you know, when we think back to we're almost headed into the 4th year of this war, and those frozen assets were immobilized from the beginning. Why did it take so long for Europe to act on this? You know, and we also have to remember, to those listeners, perhaps in Europe, who are concerned about whether their respective countries might take a hit on this. Well, altogether, all told, the entire GDP of Europe is 30 trillion euros. So 90 billion is, you know, a drop in the ocean. And You know, the other thing European leaders needed to do, I think, a long time ago, was to go to their electorate and say, look, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is what's going on. This is what could happen if Putin isn't pushed back. And you either cut spending or you raise taxes. And, you know, it's not that painful. You can do, for example, I believe it was the Danes who cut out one of their many holidays a year to save money to increase their GDP. But it's very disappointing, but on the other hand, not very surprising, because this is also a European Union that has tolerated basically a genocide on its doorstep in Gaza and has failed to do anything about it. So, and also I should note that during COVID, the European Union looked very, very divided when it came to travel bans and things like this. So once again, the Russians are looking at this and probably applauding it, not necessarily popping champagne corks, but for now, their money is still in one place in Belgium.
Yeah, it's really interesting when we talk about European taxpayers' money, because, Michael, as we know, Europe is struggling with the cost of living crisis. But I want to get on to the 90 billion euros made available from the EU loan. It's only about half of what Ukraine was actually hoping for from these frozen Russian assets. So even though it's good, it's nowhere near what they wanted. So does this mean that financing is really going to be a problem for Ukraine going forward? Like you said, is Europe making sure it's safe enough at the moment?
It will be. You're right on with that. Is that I did some math this morning, and when you take that 90 billion, you divide it by monthly expenditures, Ukraine is good for maybe 3 years if they're lucky, because a lot of this money, they need to keep their domestic drone production going. They need to buy expensive weapons from elsewhere, even though Europe and NATO are providing a lot. But there are also public sector salaries that need to be paid. Had this, I am told, I was in Kiev recently, had this money not come forth, Kiev would have had to start cutting painful things like teachers' salaries and pensions. And for the moment, the Ukrainian middle class, which is taking the burden of this war, carrying the burden of this war, is taking a heavy hit. There's now a military tax that has been doubled, and also an entrepreneur tax that has been increased to 20%. There's not much fiscal room, in other words, available to press people, the normal people, for money. So that is why Ukraine has to go overseas. But once again, I can't say it enough. You know, Europe, better to take care of this problem now and finance Ukraine, push Mr. Putin back for good, than to spend money later on building bomb shelters and schools and government offices and so on.
Michael Bociurkiw, brilliant to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your analysis, as always.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Democrats on the House Oversight Committee have released around 70 photos from Jeffrey Epstein's estate, showing high-profile figures and distributing images linked to his network. The release includes redacted passports, text messages, and quotes from Lolita written on a woman's body. Committee members say the photos raise questions about what the Department of Justice holds, as its own release deadline does arrive today. For more on this, I'm joined from California by Mary Fitilchyan, attorney at the Lisa Bloom firm, who represented a number of Epstein victims. Mary, thank you so much for joining me. Great to have you on the show. So, as I just mentioned there, more images have been released from Jeffrey Epstein's estate. Did the Democrats just cherry pick the latest pictures, or do they show us more of an insight into the Jeffrey Epstein estate and what was going on?
I can't say for sure if Democrats or Republicans in the House are cherry picking any photos. It could be that these photos don't contain any identifying information at the time being that needs to be reviewed by other people, or anything that needs to be redacted. Certainly, these are atrocious photos. The Lolita photos, the photos confirming that Epstein had high-profile people that he surrounded himself with that obviously allowed him to continue his sex trafficking empire. So it's, I think, a preview of what we are to see today in the severity of the evidence that will come out hopefully today.
How significant will the release of the files by the Department of Justice today be for some of the victims who you yourself have represented and for people who really want to know the truth?
I think it will be very significant. And I say that with the hope that the Justice Department releases the files without redacting important information as to abusers, because ultimately, the more that you protect abusers, you're enabling and ratifying their abuse. The survivors want anyone who was a sexual predator to be brought to light, anyone who is already known, anyone who may not be known. So as long as that information is revealed today in the document production, it'll be very significant for the survivors. It'll really represent one step towards justice, because revealing that information is kind of a step to get there. So that's really what they're anticipating.
My big question to you is, you just mentioned it there, the redaction, but how confident are you that once the files are released, we will get the whole truth about what went on? And like you say, things won't be heavily redacted and the victims will get justice.
We're cautiously optimistic. Of course, there's opportunities for the Department of Justice to redact certain information related to ongoing investigations. The only redactions that we would support are identifying victims' names and sensitive information regarding specific abuse to specific victims. But in terms of redactions to protect people's reputations, to save people from embarrassment, those are the redactions that, if those occur, they would be a huge breach of justice. They would represent a slap in the face to the victims who have been fighting for this transparency for years. So we're cautiously optimistic that the Department of Justice will release the information with minimum redactions, hopefully, but there is always the chance that they redact more information than they should in some people's opinions.
And Mary, despite attempts by Republicans to keep the Epstein files completely secret, President Trump has given his blessing for this information to be released. What do you make of this?
I think it's just a political playground for the president. I think that this issue of the Epstein files has really lost sight of the heart of the issue, which is the victims and the justice and the transparency that the victims deserve. This topic of Epstein has been, under the government's oversight since at least the early 2000s. So at this point in time, we've seen our administration take really strong steps to prevent the release of the files. So, it's just my opinion that the president turning around and saying release them is just a political ploy. I would like to think that it is the voice of the victims. It's the voice of the people, the real public pressure to this administration to be transparent and to release the information. But we've seen that this administration does not always respond well to public pressure, to public opinion. So it really just loses sight of the victims. And it's, in my personal opinion, a political move by the president. But, it really loses sight that at the heart of this issue are the survivors, are the people who went through that abuse, and they deserve that justice and transparency. So for what it's worth, the president did sign to order the release of the files, and we're anticipating them today.
And Mary, Jeffrey Epstein is a convicted sex offender. The public has some idea of the horrors that were committed. We've been getting images through slowly, drip feeding, but more and more details come to light. Will there be repercussions of releasing the Epstein files? Because we can't accuse anyone who's been photographed with Jeffrey Epstein of any wrongdoing, but he knew people in extremely high places and was extremely influential.
I think the repercussions will really come for those where there is clear evidence that they were involved in his sex trafficking scheme. There are obviously lawsuits from victims. Victims have claims against people, most notably Virginia Giuffre had claims against high-profile people. So if in this document production there is more information revealed about other high-profile individuals' involvement, like serious intertwined involvement with Jeffrey Epstein, they're the ones who should face those repercussions. Of course, the other side of that coin is that the victims will have to be re-traumatized by this ongoing conversation, not just about the files, but about, I've spoken with many victims who are very, very nervous about the file release today because they don't know what's in the files. They don't know what pictures will be released, what information will be released, who Jeffrey Epstein was connected to, who may still be alive, who can still, they provide a source of intimidation and stress for the victim. So truly the repercussions should come to the abusers and to anybody who enabled that abuse. And by releasing the files and by really releasing the information and the extent of how much those people were involved in Epstein's sex trafficking empire, hopefully we'll see those repercussions soon after today.
Mary Fitilchyan, brilliant to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. The suspect involved in last week's shooting at Brown University has been found dead in New Hampshire following a 6-day manhunt. 48-year-old Portuguese national Claudio Neves Valentim is a former alumni. The FBI had offered a $50,000 reward for information after the murder of 2 students. A Japanese couple have died after being trapped in a private sauna that burst into flames earlier this week. Tokyo police are investigating the cause of the incident at the Sauna Tiger in the city's Osaka district. Local media believe a faulty doorknob and an inactive emergency alarm system may have been to blame. Christian Turner has been named as the UK's new ambassador to Washington. He takes over from Lord Peter Mandelson, who was sacked by the British Prime Minister for his links to Jeffrey Epstein. Turner has been described as a career diplomat with 30 years' experience in the Foreign Office. And the Kennedy Center will be renamed as the Trump Kennedy Center. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the board of the Performing Arts Center voted unanimously for the change to honor President Donald Trump's work in saving the building. However, some Kennedy family members have criticized the move, alleging some microphones were actually muted during that vote. TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance has signed a deal to sell the social media platform's US assets and create a new entity with a group of investors, predominantly from the US. The move brings TikTok one step closer to securing its long-term future and avoiding a US government ban. Patrick Falk reports.
The deal with investors on a new TikTok US joint venture came as the social media platform celebrated its first US TikTok Awards. A lavish LA ceremony featuring Labubu dolls launched from a t-shirt cannon was live streamed around the world.
It's such a great platform that so many people have profited and benefited of. So for them to find any way to keep it is great, and I hope that they can keep the integrity of what the app initially was.
The platform currently has 170 million users in America. But it faced a ban after the Trump administration passed new legislation last year requiring the US version of the app to be spun off from its Chinese parent, ByteDance. The US president repeatedly delayed enforcement of the law as he pursued a deal to transfer control of TikTok and bring it under American ownership.
Look, we have a lot of interest in TikTok, and China is going to play a role, and so hopefully China will approve of the deal. But they're going to play a role. But we have a lot of interest in TikTok.
The transaction is not yet complete, but reports say the details of the deal are in line with the one unveiled in September. The company has signed agreements with 3 managing investors: tech giant Oracle, private equity firm Silver Lake, and the Abu Dhabi-based investment firm MGX. Set to close next month, it will end years of efforts to force ByteDance to divest its US business over national security concerns. Patrick Falk, Al Arabiya English.
Now to Bangladesh, where violence has erupted following the death of a prominent leader of the youth movement that overthrew the government of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina a year ago. Sharif Osman Hadi was gunned down by masked attackers last week as he was leaving a mosque in Dhaka and died from his injuries while being treated in Singapore. For more on this, I'm joined from New Delhi by our correspondent, Neha Poonia. Neha, brilliant to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me. Can you tell us what the situation on the ground is like right now?
Well, it's been a tense day in Bangladesh. We've seen this major outpouring of grief and anger following the death of that prominent student leader, Sharif Osman Hadi. On Thursday night, of course, we saw, angry groups of people, many supporters of his movement, the Inqilab Manch or the Platform for Revolution, descend on the streets of Dhaka and across the country when the government confirmed that he had succumbed to his injuries. He had been shot dead last week by two assailants on a motorbike and had then been taken to Singapore for treatment, where he passed away. And we saw how his protesters targeted, newspaper offices, and there was violence reported across the country. Friday was much calmer, but still tense. We saw many supporters of Hadi gathering in the heart of the capital city of Dhaka, saying that they wanted justice and that they would not disperse until justice had been served. We've seen now his mortal remains have been brought back to Dhaka. He will be laid to rest on Saturday, and his last rites will be conducted amid very tight security given the situation in the country. The government has also called his death an irreparable loss for Bangladesh, and a prayer meeting will be held in the Bangladesh Parliament House. But the focus very much now in Bangladesh on the probe, with many people asking for justice, saying that the men who shot him dead must be held and they must be tried for their crimes.
And we're just seeing the pictures of the violence across our screens. Obviously, it looks absolutely terrifying. But Neha, what's the government's response been to these protests that have unfolded?
We've heard the interim government of Bangladesh appeal for calm. It's the interim head of state, Yunus Mohammed, has said that this is a critical moment in Bangladesh's history. He released a statement earlier in the day on Friday, and I'm quoting portions of it. He's condemned, of course, the attack on the newspapers and said the nation stands by the journalists that came under attack in those instances of arson. But he's also called, this particular attack on Hadi itself a premeditated attack by those conspiring to derail the nation and the election that will be held in February. He's also said that the country's march towards democracy cannot be halted through fear, terror or bloodshed, and this was in a televised speech. We've seen how security forces have fanned out across the country in anticipation of more unrest, and this is coming after what's been a trying year for Bangladesh, given the sort of student-led uprising that led to former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's ouster. Hadi was a prominent leader of that movement, and there's obviously a lot of pressure on the interim government to not only bring his killers to justice, but also to ensure the election, which is finally being held in February, actually goes ahead. So the government, of course, appealing for calm and saying that it's working quickly to try and find his killers. About 20 people have been arrested so far.
And you said it's been a trying time for Bangladesh, but this also comes at a time when ties between India and Bangladesh have been tense too. What more can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. I mean, we saw how Sheikh Hasina's ouster set into motion a series of events because when that student-led uprising happened, she fled to New Delhi. Now, New Delhi is a country that's been closely associated with a 15-year-long tenure, and many in Bangladesh feel that New Delhi had a say in domestic politics and decisions, something that India has repeatedly denied, that Sheikh Hasina has denied, but that was at the heart of the anger that sort of spilled onto the streets when that student-led uprising happened, that Hadi was very much a prominent part of. Hadi was also a very vocal anti-India critic, and that's why we saw the sort of anger that we did in the aftermath of his death being confirmed. The newspapers that were attacked were believed to have pro-India leaning. Of course, the government has denied that and stood by those journalists that worked at those two organizations that came under attack. But we've also seen, of course, now mounting calls for India to do something, because there's, speculation on social media in Bangladesh that the men who killed Hadi may have fled across the border into India. Many saying that India should not only find those men and hand them over to Dhaka, but also at the same time send Sheikh Hasina back. Bangladesh has made, repeated pleas to India to extradite Sheikh Hasina. They have an extradition treaty. India has not formally commented on it. It says, due process is being studied, but it's quite unlikely, experts say, that India will extradite, the former head of state, and that has, made a tense situation worse.
And just quickly, I know you touched on it earlier, but how will this impact preparations for the upcoming elections in Bangladesh?
Experts say it's going to shine an even bigger spotlight on how the election is carried out, but also what happens in the run-up to the February 12th election. Hadi was shot dead just a day after those elections were announced. He was expected to contest in the polls himself. It's, of course, deeply divided the country, but it's also going to put pressure on the government and the administration to ensure there's adequate security for candidates in the run-up to the polls. There's some speculation that the election could be delayed. Of course, the government has denied that, saying that they very much want to hold this as planned, and they're claiming that this is a conspiracy by outside forces to derail the elections themselves. There are concerns that, this has worsened what's already a tense security environment in Bangladesh, and what plays out next will give us a sense of what the government plans to do about the February 12th election.
Neha Poonia in New Delhi, thank you so much for joining us. Let's take a look at the top business news now. The company behind President Trump's Truth Social platform is merging with a Google-backed energy firm in a deal worth more than $6 billion. TAE Technologies plans to produce power using heat from nuclear fusion. Construction of the world's first utility-scale fusion power plant is set to begin next year. The deal is driven by soaring electricity demand from AI data centers, which need reliable nuclear energy. Japan's central bank has raised its main interest rate to the highest level in more than 30 years as the country faces a cost of living squeeze. Official figures showed inflation, excluding food and fuel, rose by 3% in November, above the target rate of 2%. The move comes as the new Prime Minister proposes a reduction in the interest rate and lower borrowing costs. Turning to all the sports news now, and Australia were firmly on top in the Ashes cricket test in Adelaide, leading England by 356 runs after day 3. England struggled to break through Australia's batting lineup, and captain Ben Stokes did not bowl in the second innings. Stokes, hampered by leg cramps and dehydration, scored his slowest ever Test 50. A former US NASCAR driver and his family were among the 7 people killed in a plane crash at a regional airport in North Carolina yesterday. Investigators found that the jet erupted into a large fire when it hit the ground on the east end of the runway. Greg Biffle, who won more than 50 races across NASCAR's 3 circuits, was traveling with his wife and their 2 children. And the Seattle Seahawks beat the Los Angeles Rams in overtime, securing a place at this season's NFL playoffs. The Rams were the first team to end a postseason spot on Sunday, while the Seahawks will return after a 2-year absence. Now it's the Friday fight night we've all been waiting for. Anthony Joshua versus Jake Paul in Miami. The former world heavyweight champion will take on the social media star this evening, streaming, of course, live on Netflix. Currently, Joshua is looking like the favourite as he seeks to revive his career. But analysts are not discounting a victory for Paul, who will want to prove himself in the ring. For more on this, I'm joined live now from Miami by boxing correspondent Gareth A Davies. Gareth, brilliant to have you on the show. Right, it's finally here. One of the most anticipated fights of the year. Everyone has obviously had their say. Why has it been seen as so controversial?
Well, the golf, thank you for having me on. The golf in class, experience, ability is self-evident. That Anthony Joshua, gilded with gold, Olympic super heavyweight champion in London in 2012, 2-time heavyweight champion of the world. He's only really lost to a couple of the greats, Alexander Usyk, who's the #1 in the division. And he's up against a smaller, lighter guy who began on the Disney Channel and 5 years ago took up boxing, and has spoken into existence the fact that he wants to fight the very best in the world. So there's genuine worries and fears for the health and safety of Jake Paul going into this. But he talks about having a delusional optimism, does young Jake. And so he's really up against it, to be honest. And we need something of, perhaps I can say, biblical proportions. David beating Goliath again for him to get victory tonight.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I actually watched Anthony Joshua during the Olympics when he won that gold, and I remember it was absolutely incredible. But right now, you're lucky enough to be in Miami for the spectacle. These 2 stars, as you say, you know, from very different worlds with millions of fans. What is the atmosphere like at the moment as the build-up to the big fight continues?
Well, it takes place in the Miami Heat's stadium, the Kaseya Center today, the NBA team. I'm sitting here on Ocean Drive at the moment on South Beach. It's an amazing place, of course, and it's the perfect place for Jake Paul, who kind of has a domicile now in Puerto Rico, just across the water, to showcase I think for his 70-odd million subscribers online, that anything is possible. I think that's what this is about. And I think, as you say, I mean, it was an amazing occasion in London when Anthony Joshua signaled himself as a future star. He's the B-side on this. For example, he's the right-hand side on the poster as Anthony Joshua. He's played the game all week. And in the 5 weeks since this was announced, that this is the Jake Paul show. It's Disneyland for boxing, if you like. Jake Paul's beaten a couple of legends in the ring, and everyone says, oh, is it scripted? Is it meant to happen a certain way? Anthony Joshua has played along with him. They've had a lot of fun on the way. Jake Paul's tried to wind him up. Joshua said he's going to knock him out and beat him up tonight. I suspect that he will marinate him very slowly and take his time in there, but I do not see, I mean, I wrote today in the Telegraph that when Jake hits him with his bigger shot, it probably will be like a pebble hitting a tank. And that may be a reality and a wake-up call for Jake Paul when they step in, when the bell rings at about 10 p.m. Local time here in Miami.
I find that so fascinating because, you know, as we were talking about, AJ is a seasoned professional boxer. When he was boxing, Jake Paul was literally making YouTube videos. So I wonder how Anthony Joshua is going to play this. Is he going to let him stew? But I'll take your word for it because I'll see exactly what happens. But you just spoke to me. Both AJ and Paul have traded remarks, of course, back and forth in the run-up to this fight. I think AJ's actually been quite composed. Who do you think has the most to gain? And also, who has the most to lose? Because it's quite interesting. AJ hasn't really been on the forefront of boxing since the last loss.
Yeah, 15 months ago at Wembley Stadium, a catastrophic loss at the time against Daniel Dubois for the heavyweight title, one of the belts in the heavyweight division. I mean, he's got a massive, potentially massive fight with Tyson Fury, a book era, an era-ending fight with Tyson Fury. They've been on the same trajectory for 10 years. So if he loses, that really consigns that to dust. So there's a lot for Joshua to lose if the fight goes too long, if it goes 8 rounds, the full 8 3-minute rounds, because people are expecting him to deal with Jake Paul handily and just play it how he wants to play it. What's Jake Paul got to gain? I think he's won already. He's a huge star. Netflix, and that's the big picture here, have centered their kind of game, if you like, their live game. We binge on Netflix with series, don't we? This is their entry into live sports and live events. This is the 4th event they've done in 13 months, 3 of them involving Jake Paul, or certainly women's boxing as well. Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano have garnered 6 million views. You know, when you think that he and Mike Tyson 13 months ago garnered 108 million views online, it shows you where these streaming giants are going. So that's the bigger picture. Where do they both gain? I think they get about $50 million each for this fight, because it will do massive numbers. And it just starts to make sports broadcasters look at what pay-per-view is as opposed to streaming. There's a bigger picture going on here as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was one of those 108 million who watched Jake Paul fight Mike Tyson. But, you know, I just want to pick up on something you mentioned to me, because a lot of people have been talking about Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua. Now, let's be honest, this is a fight we've all been wanting to see for so long. What's Tyson's camp saying? If AJ wins this, will Tyson Fury come out of retirement? What's the deal there?
Well, I think he's having a bit of FOMO at the moment, Tyson Fury. When Anthony Joshua 48 hours ago said, I mean, and I say this, I'm quoting him, that he would kill Jake Paul in the ring, and we were all very concerned about that phrase to begin with. And then he explained it a day later, that what he meant was, you're licensed to kill in there. And I think he was causing a bit of drama. Tyson Fury responded from his Land Rover with all his 7 kids inside back in the UK, saying, you know, you big dosser, as he calls people. What are you doing at 37 years of age? And a former heavyweight champion saying you're going to kill a YouTuber in the ring. So he's clearly waiting for his opportunity to sit next to Anthony Joshua on a press conference table and announce the big fight. We hear it is being talked about in the background. They'll both have warm-up fights in the spring next year. That's what we're hearing. And then they'll fight late summer, maybe with some financial backing from the great motivator and disruptor in boxing over the last 3 years, Turki Al-Sheikh, the Saudi Arabian minister. We hear he's involved as well, with Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren, the promoters of the respective fighters. But as you rightly say, we need to see that fight, certainly in sporting terms, next year, to close the era, as you say, because they've been very close to having fights several times, and for one reason and another it hasn't happened. I do hope we do get that fight this era. You know, I've covered boxing for 35 years, and it'll be a travesty to see it not happen.
You know what, I really hope that we get that fight too, because I would love to watch it and love to have you come on the show and talk to me about it. And I always think Tyson Fury, the Gypsy King, he's the best, isn't he, when he gives those big conferences and those weigh-ins. He always sings. He's the light and life sometimes of the boxing universe, isn't he, Gareth?
He is. He's very, look, he apes the time of Muhammad Ali, who was the first to use psychological warfare and wind his opponents up. And it's natural in some people. And I do think we've got a natural villain and a natural good guy if AJ, Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury do cross the T's and dot the I's and get that fight signed for next year. It'll probably be a 2-fight deal as well, I imagine, one in Riyadh and one at Wembley Stadium.
Well, tonight it's all about Jake Paul and Anthony Joshua, so we'll have to see how that goes. But Gareth A Davies, I'm so jealous that you're in Miami right now, but I hope you have a great time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am.
Brilliant. A reminder of our top stories. EU leaders strike a €90 billion deal to bankroll Ukraine's war effort, but frozen Russian assets do remain off the table. Newly released photos from Jeffrey Epstein's estate raise fresh questions about his network and what the DOJ may be holding. And protests erupt across Bangladesh after the death of the student leader who overthrew Sheikh Hasina's government. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and, of course, follow us on X. We'll be back in a couple of hours' time with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you for watching.